Welcome to your lecture about John Adams' presidency. By the end of this video, you are going to know about the XYZ affair, the Alien and Sedition Acts, the Virginia and Kentucky Resolution, and the election of 1800. President George Washington decides to step down after 2 terms in office. John Adams, Federalist and former vice president, becomes the 2nd president of the United States. Thomas Jefferson, a Democratic Republican, becomes his vice president. At this time, candidates did not select a running mate or someone to run as their vice president. Instead, the runner-up or the second-place winner would automatically be given the job of vice president. Because of this, you now have a Federalist president and a Democratic Republican vice president. From the very beginning of the Adams administration, the U.S. began to drift toward war with France. The French were angry about Jay's Treaty with the British and began seizing American ships in the French harbor. Trying to avoid war, Adams sends officials to Paris to negotiate with the government. Once in Paris, secret agents of the French foreign minister met with the American officials. These agents were later identified only as X, Y, and Z. The French agents demanded a bribe of $250,000 and a loan to the French of $10 million before the Americans would even be allowed to see the French foreign minister. Though such a request was a common practice in European diplomacy, it outraged Americans and it became known as the XYZ affair. Refusing to pay the bribe, the American diplomats quickly returned home. They were met with public cries of patriotism, war, and defiance against the French. The slogan, "Millions for defense, but not 1 cent for the tribute," meaning bribery, rang out in the U.S. Unable to resolve their differences by 1798, the U.S. was involved in an undeclared war. Both sides fired on and seized each other's ships. The Federalists took advantage of the war crisis and Adams' popularity to push the important new measure through Congress. Among these were an increase to the size of the Army, high taxes to support the Army and Navy, and the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. Under the Alien Act, the President gained the right to imprison or deport citizens of other countries residing in the U.S. deemed to be dangerous. It also increased the number of years an alien needed to wait before applying for citizenship from 5 years to 14 years. Under the Sedition Act, persons who wrote, published, or said anything of a false, scandalous, or malicious nature against the American government or its officials could be fined or jailed. In other words, it was against the law to criticize government officials unless you could prove everything you said. The Federalists used the Sedition Act to silence the Democratic-Republican opposition. Under this act, 10 Democratic Republicans were convicted and many others were tried. Jefferson, James Madison, and other Democratic Republicans believed that the Sedition Act violated the constitutional protection of freedom of speech. Jefferson and Madison believed that the states should make that judgment. They've responded to the Alien and Sedition Acts with the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. These resolutions, adopted by the legislatures of Virginia and Kentucky, argued that the states had the right to judge whether federal laws agreed with the Constitution. If a state decided that a law was unconstitutional, it could declare that a law was null and void within that state. Neither Virginia nor Kentucky tried to enforce these resolutions, however, their defiance of federal power was clear. Tensions between the Federalist and Democratic Republicans continued to grow during the late 1790s. As the presidential election of 1800 loomed, many people believed that the future of the nation was at stake. The personal attacks and negative campaigning of election today are nothing new. The election of 1800 was truly a nasty campaign. Democratic Republicans accused Adams of being a monarchist, which was a terrible insult at the time, and Federalists accused Jefferson of being a godless man that could lead the nation into chaos. Jefferson wins the popular vote in the election of 1800, but failed to get the majority in the Electoral College. Therefore, the House of Representatives would have to choose their new president. they elect Thomas Jefferson as the third president of the United States of America. On March 4th, 1801, Thomas Jefferson took the oath of office administered by one of Adams' appointees, Chief Justice John Marshall. With this inauguration, the Federalist leaders of the young country proved that they could do what so many leaders in other times and places in history had refused to do. Although few on either side could forget the bitter disagreements, the Federalists stepped down and let the Democratic Republicans take over. Whether they stood for individual liberty or a strong central government, Americans proved that they could transfer power from one party to another and do it peacefully. So by now you should be able to answer the following 5 questions. Why were the French upset with the U.S. at the beginning of the Adams presidency? Explain the XYZ affair and its impact on the U.S. What are the Alienist Edition Acts and how did it violate the Constitution? What are the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions? And finally, what is the importance of the election of 1800?